why I did not show up. I had it on my schedule that I was going to be coming down to FIU, and at the time my wife was pregnant with triplets. So as we got a little closer to D-Day, my doctor said, listen, you can go down to Florida, but I can't guarantee you that you're going to actually catch the birth of your 3 children. So I just had to make a judgment call. My wife thanks me today, and I thank you all for understanding. Everybody's down here now with me in South Florida. We actually took the kids on their first airplane flight, which was slightly more complex than what we'll talk about tonight. Apart from those thank yous, I also want to thank everybody here for not being a Yankees or a Phillies fan, otherwise you would not be here tonight. I actually am a Phillies fan, and I'm DVRing this, and we'll have to check out the World Series when I get home. What we're going to talk about tonight is something that I started to look at probably around the time where I met a young scholar by the name of Shlomi Dinar. I was living in Israel and was traveling quite a bit, to the chagrin of my mother, to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on a regular basis. And it was during that time that I began to realize that there were some very stark differences that existed between these two territories. Differences that it was not very popular to talk about. I was there in the 1990s when this was, of course, the heyday of the peace process, right? I mean, this was during the Oslo period, as we call it, where there was a great deal of optimism over peace that would happen between the Arabs and Israelis, or between the Palestinians and Israelis, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would become a state for the Palestinians, and it was argued that we were well on our way to that final goal. But as I traveled back and forth between these two areas, I could not help but sense that these two territories were just too different, and that the leadership between these two territories that I had the occasion to meet from time to time also were very different and had very different aims. And not to mention that there was an area about 30 miles called the Negev Desert separating these two territories. Flash forward to today, and it is not so unfashionable to talk about it. As a matter of fact, it's something that probably needs to be talked about. Granted, we are not hearing it on the news. We are not hearing about this on CNN. We're not hearing about it on Fox. We're not hearing about it on National Palestine Radio, NPR. We are not hearing about this potential split between the West Bank and Gaza, despite the fact that we now have 2 different governments led by 2 different factions, 2 different leaders, 2 different funding sources, again separated by 30 miles of the Negev Desert. And this was what prompted me to write this book. So what I'd like to do, with your permission, is to talk just a little bit about how we got here, just for a few minutes, and then talk about exactly what it means. But if you take nothing away from today's lecture, it should be you only take away the following. And that is that if tomorrow Israel decided that it wanted to cede the entire West Bank, okay, it wanted to pull up all of the settlements, it wanted to tear down all of the checkpoints in the West Bank, these checkpoints that invoke the ire of the Palestinian people, if Israel were to hand over every Muslim holy site in Jerusalem, and then on top of that allow for, let's say, 50 or 100,000 refugees, people, Palestinians claiming to be refugees, to live inside Israel proper. If all of these things were ceded by the Israeli government, which, by the way, will never happen under Benjamin Netanyahu. So for anyone that was getting upset about it, you can take your blood pressure medicine and relax, because it won't happen tomorrow. But the point is that even if all of those things were ceded tomorrow, there would be nobody on the Palestinian side who would be able to ratify that agreement. And the primary reason for that is that the Palestinians are too divided. There is a civil war that is raging within the Palestinian territories, making all of the other things that we're talking about on the road to peace non-negotiable. What we're looking at right now is the simple fact that whenever you sit down for negotiations, anytime there is diplomacy that takes place, the most basic building blocks is that you know who speaks for one side and who speaks for the other, right? We know who speaks for the Israelis. There is an Israeli prime minister. Whether you like him or not is really not the point. Whether the Israelis like him or not, right now he happens to hold a majority within the Knesset. On the other side, however, we have Hamas and we have Fatah, 2 factions that are involved in a bitter power struggle that involves a war of words, but also a war of guns. And until they are able to iron this out, and until somebody speaks for a majority of the Palestinian people, we are going to find ourselves in a deadlock. And I say this, I should note this right up front, that I say this with no glee. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. What I have been trying to do, and by writing this book, my goal was to alert policymakers to a pitfall. In other words, our ultimate goal is to have Israel and the Palestinians living side by side in peace and sharing economics and sharing, even possibly, aspects of a political system. But until this problem is solved, there is no way to even get to the negotiating table to have a successful agreement to get to that point. It is a basic building block, and to my chagrin, in Washington, our members of Congress, our White House, continue to overlook this problem, despite the fact that it is staring us in the face. Now, the question is, how did it all begin? It began, and I'll just try to breeze through this. I'll give you 5 minutes of Palestinian history, that'll cover, 20 or 30 years. But the basics is that in the 1987 Intifada, the uprising that began when the Palestinians began to agitate for their individual freedoms against Israel, the Fatah faction, led by Yasser Arafat, who was based in Tunisia, attempted to sort of gain control of these uprisings. So in other words, all the rock throwing and the sniping and the demonstrations and the strikes, these were all, Arafat tried to coordinate them from his base in Tunisia. He had been ousted by the Israelis from Lebanon in the early 1980s, and there he stayed in exile. Now, as the Intifada evolved and as it began to gain popular support on the streets of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, a new organization sprouted up, known as Hamas. It was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization founded in the 1920s in Egypt. And the difference between these two organizations became very stark. By the year 1988 or 1989, there were very, very different organizations. Hamas wanted to forward a more Islamic vision of the Palestinian territories. They saw an Islamic Palestine. Whereas Arafat's Fatah faction, a more secular organization, really just wanted to have a seat at the table, or at least that's what they were arguing on the world stage. So by the year 1993, Yasser Arafat had cut a deal with the international community that if he accepted the existence of the State of Israel, he would be welcomed back into the territories, and he began to negotiate with Israel in the Oslo process, tried to negotiate peace with the Israelis. This was when we began to see the true rise of the Hamas organization. What was Hamas known best for? Suicide bombings. Now, the way that we heard about these suicide bombings here in the West, we heard a very simple explanation, that this Islamist organization, this jihadist organization, wanted to kill as many Jews and Israelis as possible in an effort to destroy the Jewish state. And that is, to a certain extent, true. But those suicide bombings had a second message, which I believe went largely overlooked in our mainstream media and definitely overlooked in our ivory towers, in our universities here in the United States. And that is that Hamas was also trying to derail the leadership of Fatah. They were trying to explain that Fatah did not speak for all of the Palestinians, and they were willing to carry out brutal acts of violence in order to demonstrate that. They were trying to demonstrate that Fatah alone did not represent the Palestinian cause. And this continued, as we all know, throughout the 1990s, and Hamas continued to gain popularity to the point that it was almost neck and neck with Arafat by the end of the 1990s. So by the year 2000, when President Clinton tried to force a peace process, tried to end the dispute for once and for all, Arafat had to make a very painful decision. If he signed on the dotted line with Israel, would he still have the popular support of the Palestinian people? He decided that that would not be the case. So what he decided to do was to, as I say in the book, he tries to out Hamas, the Hamas organization. He launches a second intifada steeped in Islamic symbols. He calls it the Al-Aqsa Intifada. He talks about 1 million martyrs marching on Jerusalem. These were all things that spoke to the Islamic sensitivities of the Palestinians. And obviously, as we all know, the Israelis cracked down. And by the year 2004, when Yasser Arafat died, there was absolute chaos on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza. By the year 2006, upon the prodding of the U.S. government, upon the prodding of the White House and the State Department, an election was held. And in that election, probably the freest and fairest elections in the Middle East, Hamas wins by a significant portion. By the year 2007, after a deadlock that ensued between the Hamas and Fatah factions. In other words, after Hamas won, Fatah said, "You're not going to take over our government." And they engaged in political deadlock, but they also began to exchange shots. They actually began to fight on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza. So by the year 2007, in June, a civil war broke out. And this civil war was probably one of the most brutal that we have seen in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it was not between Palestinians and Israelis. We had Palestinians pushing other Palestinians off of tall buildings to their death. We had Palestinians shooting each other in the legs and arms to ensure permanent disability. This did not get the media attention or the academic attention that it deserved. The international community, our government, our academics chose not to look at this, but has instead focused continually on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But again, I argue that as long as this conflict persists, you will not see a final peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis because the Palestinians are so divided. If one faction signs an agreement with Israel, the other one will reject it out of hand, because they do not reject the other's legitimacy. And this will continue and needs to be solved. So what I argue right now is that while Washington continues to press Israel on settlements in Jerusalem and the like, this is not to say that these issues are not important. They certainly are. And Israel will have to make painful decisions down the line. But if I were sitting in the State Department today and I had the ear of Hillary Clinton, or if I had the ear of President Barack Obama, I would say, let's not worry about that right now because we're putting the cart before the horse. We need to get Israel to go back to its corner and come up with its best deal. Whatever it can offer to the Palestinians that it believes that would lead to peace, that will be Israel's job. On the Palestinian side, we need to find out who speaks for them first. We need to figure out how to solve this conflict if we are ever to move forward. Now, apart from that, and getting back to some of my travels early on, we have a problem of geography. Right now, because of this conflict, because of the civil war that took place in 2007 that enabled Hamas to take over the Gaza Strip, we now have two Palestinian states. We have West Bankistan, or Fatah land, if you want to call it that. We've got Hamasistan, or Gazastan, whatever you like to call it on the other side, but they are now two different governments, led by two different leaders, with financial backing in the Gaza Strip from Iran, and financial backing from the Arab world and even the United States and even Israel on the West Bank. So we've got two different, very different political entities here. And the fact remains is that the United States holds two different foreign policies towards them. Very, very clearly. We've got sanctions on one, and we're helping out the other. We're actually even helping to build an army. General Keith Dayton right now is building up an army of Palestinians. Do I support this measure? I would actually argue that we've seen this movie before. It didn't end well in the form of the 2000 Intifada, but nonetheless, this has been our policy, and we understand that this is why they're doing it. They're trying to build up a stronger Fatah faction to weaken the Hamas faction. But so now, apart from the politics, we've got a very difficult issue of geography. Okay, up in the 1948 war, when Israel won its independence, it won its independence, and the Jordanians and Egyptians also won territory during that period. The Egyptians took over, dare I say, occupied the Gaza Strip, and the Jordanians occupied the West Bank. Now, from 1948 until 1967, when they controlled these territories, nobody ever talked about these as Palestinian lands. They were talked about as Jordanian and Egyptian lands. After 1967, after Israel wrested control of these territories from both Jordan and Egypt, that's when Israel began to talk about these two territories being a Palestinian state. They basically dangled these two territories to the Palestinians and said, if you play ball, if you sign a peace agreement with us, if you can end this conflict, we will find a way of connecting the West Bank and Gaza Strip for you. This will be your state. So the 30 miles of Negev desert that separate these two, we can figure out how to bridge them. Through a tunnel, through a superhighway, through a bridge, something will be able to connect these two territories again so that you can have a contiguous state. Now, that was the plan throughout the 1990s until the launch of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, Arafat's ill-fated decision in 2000. At that point, what did the Israelis do? They built a wall. They built a wall around the entirety of the Gaza Strip and about 2/3 of the West Bank. Why only 2/3? It's prohibitively expensive. It costs about $10 million per kilometer along this fence. And there's actually a joke that my colleague David Makovsky from the Washington Institute used to tell which I still think is very valid today, and that is that if Israel really wanted to finish this separation barrier, all it would need to do is to come down to South Florida and pledge to put up plaques on the wall to Jewish communities. It wouldn't take very long to raise the money, although maybe not in this economy. But anyway, David said that he was going to call it Plakistan and that we had it all figured out. But at any rate, that didn't happen. The Israelis have actually done fairly well with their 2/3 of the fence. It has actually stopped all but one suicide bombing in Israel over the last 5 years. There was one, I believe, in 2007 in the town of Dimona. That was the only suicide bombing that has happened against Israeli civilians since the wall has reached its current form. So the question is, would the Israelis actually at this point even think about tearing down these walls and allowing the Palestinians to connect, given the fact that you've got two different governments, one that is extremely hostile to Israel in the form of Hamas, and one that is mildly hostile to Israel in the form of Fatah. Why do I say mildly? Well, one of the things that I talk about in this book is that neither side is really a wonderful partner for peace. And this is a very difficult thing for Americans to grasp. We are told right now that we have a moderate Fatah faction. Right? It is so moderate that we have assigned a general from the U.S. Army to go out and build an army for them. And if you look up their charter, and I recommend that everyone do this, if you haven't seen it, go home, Google Fatah Charter English, and you will find the Fatah Charter, and it also calls for the destruction of the State of Israel. So there are questions about why Israel would want to allow one more radical faction that could perhaps even topple the West Bank. I mean, Hamas did it in the Gaza Strip. Could it do it again? According to one of my sources, a guy who works for Haaretz, he says that several months ago it would have taken Hamas 3 days to topple the Gaza Strip. Now it could possibly take 3 months. Either way, that's not a gamble I don't think the Israelis are willing to take right now. So the Israelis are not very interested in connecting these two territories. But then there are some other factors, and I actually question this in my book, and this is probably one of the more controversial things that I raise, but there is a question of whether these two territories should be connected in the first place, based on politics, based on economics, and based on culture. From the 1948 to 1967 era, when these two territories were controlled by Egypt and Jordan, they had an immense amount of influence on these two territories. If you go to these areas, as I did during graduate school, I don't recommend going now very much for a Club Med vacation or anything like that, but if you go to the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, you will hear two different dialects. In the West Bank, you will hear a Jordanian dialect. They speak a different language than they do in the Gaza Strip. Not everybody, but a good number of people speak a Jordanian Shami dialect. And then if you go to the Gaza Strip, you'll hear more of an Egyptian one. Economically speaking, if you go to the Gaza Strip, you'll see that it's somewhere around 40, maybe even more, 40% refugees. So poverty is everywhere, and there is no economy to speak of. People live off of the UN dole. If you go to the West Bank, this is an area that has been, and not to mention the fact that it was quite flattened by the Israelis during the war of December 2008 and January 2009, and has not been getting the aid that it needs to rebuild because Hamas is still in charge and Hamas is still a recognized terrorist organization. You go to the West Bank and you will see a very different picture. It was untouched during the 2008-2009 war, and on top of that, the United States, the Egyptians, the Saudis, everyone is giving money to the West Bank to try to prop it up, to try to make it this ideal Palestinian state so that maybe it can serve as an example to those living in the Gaza Strip that they need to topple the Hamas leadership. So what we're seeing right now is as time goes by, as aid flows in, you're seeing the differences between these two territories exacerbating at an alarming rate. And then on top of that, we've got the fact that these two factions are not willing to reconcile. The Egyptians in the last year have tried to bring Hamas and Fatah together probably about a dozen times. And actually not just the Egyptians, but the Yemenis, the Mauritanians, I believe the Libyans at one point. There have been Arab actors that have tried to intervene to try to bring the Palestinians back together again, because after all, how can they blame Israel for everything that they blame Israel for while the Palestinians are divided? As a matter of fact, the Palestinians don't like to admit that they are divided, because they would rather blame Israel for their problems. And they actually still say that Israel is to blame for it. But when you look at how they have fought each other, Israel has stepped back and has really tried not to get involved. What They are trying to increase security, but that's about it in the West Bank. But what we saw during the 2008-2009 war was, I believe, somewhat remarkable. We had a Palestinian leadership that got up and said on Al Jazeera, on Arabic television, to an Arabic audience, we understand why Israel went into the Gaza Strip, because Israel cannot suffer the thousands of missile attacks that it has endured over the last several years. This was a Palestinian leader. This was unprecedented. And on top of that, there were reports coming primarily from Jeffrey Goldberg in the New Yorker that the Fatah faction was actually providing coordinates, targeting coordinates to the Israelis during the 2008-2009 war in order to try to take out the Hamas enemies of theirs inside the Gaza Strip. So what we are seeing right now, ladies and gentlemen, is probably not a good breeding ground for a two-state solution between the Arabs and Israelis. I hope what I've described here today is to demonstrate that things have gotten, the last thing we probably needed in the Middle East is a little bit more complexity. But we are looking at right now is a much more complex situation than what we are led to believe through our State Department and through the White House. What we are looking at probably right now, if things continue down this line, is the perhaps eventuality of more of a three-state solution. One that is recognized by Israel and the United States in the form of West Bankistan. We would probably call it Palestine or the Palestinian Authority one day down the line. But the Iranian-sponsored Hamas organization in the Gaza Strip is not letting go of its hold anytime soon. And this will remain a rogue area about the size of Washington, D.C., which contains about 1.5 million people. It cannot be discarded as not important to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It will remain a factor, but it may not be part of a future agreement. I believe that we need to start dealing with this now if we are ever to find a peaceful solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now, every time I give this lecture, people say, well, can you at least tell me something positive? So I'm going to try to end on that. What I believe is that the one thing that can probably turn this around is Palestinian leadership. And there are people who exist right now who believe in a more democratic Palestinian political system. They believe in economic development as the key to fostering good relations between Palestinians and Israelis. But what we are really looking for is a charismatic leader, a Martin Luther King or a Mahatma Gandhi, somebody who can come up through the ranks, heck, even a Nelson Mandela, who can come up through the ranks and who can capture the imagination of the Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat once did it by wearing fatigues and a black and white checkered keffiyeh and a 2-day-old stubble with a holster at his side, and he used to call himself Mr. Palestine, and he was fighting, as he described it, day and night for the Palestinian cause. What we need to see is now somebody who can show up in a suit and can capture the same imagination of the Palestinian people. To date, we have not seen that. We've got contenders. Salam Fayyad, who is the current prime minister, is a possibility, but this is not a man who has captured the imagination. There are people out there who are working at the grassroots level, and our hope and our goal here, I think everybody in this room, everybody in Washington, is to empower those Palestinians to come up through the ranks so that one day the Israelis will have that interlocutor and we can get right back to that two-state solution that I think we all yearn for. Thank you very much. Proxies battling it out on the Palestinian stage, which is incredibly unfortunate because the Palestinians have fallen victim to this time and time again throughout history. Arab nationalists have done this, royalists have done it. In the past, the Arabs have always used the Palestinian cause, or the Muslim world has used the Palestinian cause as sort of a way to either beat Israel or to beat each other. And they're doing it again right now. Right now, it's the Arab world versus Iran. It's Islamist versus secular, and it's incredibly frustrating to watch because the Palestinians, quite frankly, are among the most educated people in the Arab world. They have the best foundation for democracy, and they have the best foundation for making the best decisions. And I have not seen them stand up to these powers, and primarily it's because both of these powers, both Fatah and Hamas, control very powerful militias, and they can also buy off various families and clans and tribes within these territories, and that's what enables them to become as powerful as they are today. Now, as for the Sunni and Shia divide, it's very interesting. Hamas is, of course, a Sunni organization. This, in fact, the Palestinian people are about 98 or 99% Sunni, depending on who you talk to. So how is it that an Iranian Shiite country can gain such control over a Sunni organization? Well, the fact remains is that the organization was first funded by primarily Saudi money, then Kuwaiti and Qatari money, and other wealthy Gulfies also got involved. But in the year 2004, and I actually talk about this quite a bit, if you all remember, there were a series of attacks that took place inside the Saudi kingdom in 2004. Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula began to attack Saudi targets, and the Saudis were feeling what I would probably describe as blowback. In other words, they had been building this Islamist infrastructure that they had been exporting to all these other countries and making people suffer at the hands of violent extremists. Well, the chickens had come home to roost, and all of a sudden attacks were taking place inside the kingdom, and the Saudis decided to draw down on the funding that they were providing for Islamist groups around the world, including Hamas. And Hamas found its best supporter in the form of Iran. And Iran jumped on this and is essentially, in my opinion, creating a new sort of proxy in the same way that they had co-opted Hezbollah in the 1980s. They are co-opting Hamas now in this early part of the decade until now. So that's that hopefully I think answers all of your questions. But it has been a long road for the Hamas organization, and they have grown over time, but primarily due to the influence of Iran. Which is obviously extremely disconcerting. And by the way, one of the things that people talk about right now is that if Israel does muster up the courage to attack Iran, to try to thwart its nuclear program, even if it is successful in taking out all of the suspected targets, and there could be a dozen or 24 of them, Israel would also have to deal with a rocket threat unleashed by Iran through their proxies in the Gaza Strip through Hamas, and through Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Hamas is now very much a part of the sort of Iranian calculus. I wrote a piece for Commentary magazine, I guess about 7 or 8 months ago, that talks about this, the Iranian gambit in Gaza. And if you're really interested in learning more about it, I go into a little bit more depth there. You know, the Iranians, in short, have done something that I think most people weren't aware of. They have essentially played a masterful game of chess. Some people say that chess was invented in Iran. They call it shachmat, kill the king. Although some people say it was also invented in India, and I guess the Iranians and Indians have a conflict over that. But you know, what the Iranians have done is they've put a pawn in Lebanon. They've now put a pawn in Gaza. They have potentially a pawn in Syria, because Syria has a close alliance with the Iranians right now, and they have chemical and biological weapons and long-range missiles that could hit pretty much any part of Israel. Not to mention that there is also an Iranian base in Sudan. And they're trying to undermine the Egyptian regime. So in other words, the Iranians maybe don't even need a nuclear weapon to achieve their objective. By just simply placing pawns all around Israel and then unleashing attacks, Israel might have to endure a several-front war, even without having to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat. Yes, sir?
2 points. During the caste-led war in Gaza, could the Israelis have gone further and taken over Gaza and preventing Hamas from accomplishing what they did? And the other point is, how strong are the Saudis in this picture? Could they influence the Palestinians in the West Bank to make peace? I understand they're supposed to be very influential.
Okay, 2 very good questions. One is, in answer to your question about whether Israel could have gone in. Well, there are 2 issues at play here. One is, were they allowed to? And two, was it in their best interest? Were they allowed to is a very interesting question, because if anybody actually was following the war, Israel was driving deeper and deeper into Gaza, and then all of a sudden decided that the war was over. Why? It was on the eve of inauguration here in the United States. I believe that, you know, I can't prove this, I can't tell you that this definitely happened, but I don't think that it was in our president's best interests to have a war going on in the Middle East as he celebrated inauguration, and I think he probably prevailed upon the Israelis to cease hostilities during that time. And I think the Israelis probably, quite frankly, were also looking for an excuse to get out, because that leads me to point number 2. If Israel did topple Hamas in the Gaza Strip, what could they do? If they put another leader in power, that leader will be rejected like an artificial heart. In other words, everything that Israel touches is seen as some sort of a conspiracy. It is antithetical to the Palestinian goal, right? So if Israel says, here's your new leader, take it, they're going to reject it simply because Israel recommended it. So Israel, I think, realized that there was very little it could do. It could probably have destroyed all of the Hamas leadership and even a few more rockets and weapons caches and things like that. But the question is, was it the devil that they know? Was that better than what might be able to sneak in instead of Hamas? And I don't have the answers. I think that there was some very difficult decisions made in the Central Command Office in Tel Aviv, as they decided to cease this war, whether they wanted to completely wipe out Hamas or allow it to continue in a weaker form. I believe that there was probably not a good option, because as we see now today, Hamas in a weaker form grew to Hamas in a much stronger form, and it now represents just as much of a threat to Israel as it did in November before Israel launched Cast Lead. Now, as for the other question, the Saudi influence, I can tell you that this whole notion of Palestinian unity is dogging the entire Arab world. Okay, the fact that the Palestinians do not have a unified leadership and that there is nobody that can actually legitimately sign peace is a problem for the Arabs, because again, they used to be able to blame everything. Whether it was water problems, whether it was political problems, financial problems, it was always Israel's fault. Now, and especially vis-a-vis the Palestinian dilemma, right now it's becoming increasingly clear to those who follow the region that the Palestinians are largely to blame for not being able to reach their political aspirations. So the Saudis would probably love to say, listen, sign peace, but they know that they cannot do it unless it is one that encompasses all of the Palestinian people. It is not legitimate in the eyes of the Arab world. If you've got what they want, actually, I mean, the minimal equation is that the West Bank and Gaza Strip become all of Palestine. Okay? They want more. If you listen to the rhetoric in Arabic, they want all of Israel, they want all the West Bank, they want all the Gaza Strip. But to say that they're only going to sign an agreement that would include the West Bank is an admission of further defeat, and that's not something that anybody in the Arab world is willing to swallow. But it's very interesting because nobody likes to talk about this publicly. Nobody says, we need to solve the Palestinian problem first. They continue to say, Israel's policies in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are illegitimate. But what they don't recognize is that there are two different policies, two different areas towards two different groups. And I think it's an important distinction, and I think one that the Saudis and really the rest of the Arab world understand. They just don't like to talk about it, which is why I think it's important to talk about it here. Yeah, Gail.
Yeah, first of all, there really was no Palestinian people prior to 1967, and this was admitted by some so-called Palestinians. They constructed this entire revisionist history. In fact, those that are in the West Bank are really Jordanians, and I understand that there are many who continue to live in Jordan and only maintain some kind of a dwelling in the West Bank in order to be able to collect United Nations welfare through UNRWA. Now, the ones that are in Gaza are actually probably from Egypt, as you said, and the Muslim Brotherhood, we all know, is the parent organization even of Al-Qaeda. Now, to think that anyone in his right mind would want to create a terrorist state, considering that one of the qualifications for statehood is that you have to demonstrate that you can construct an organized society, and both in the West Bank and in Gaza, they have clearly demonstrated that they're not ready. Why is anybody talking about this?
Well, you raise a couple of interesting points, and I probably can't speak to all of them, but I'll try to address a few. The Palestinian nationalist movement is one, for better or for worse, that I think we can't deny at this point. There are, in fact, millions of people claiming to be Palestinians who have demanded a state, and the facts are now on the ground. The United States has been dealing with Palestinians. It hasn't always been that way. Quite frankly, I think it might have worked out for the best if Jordan and Egypt remained in control of those two territories and eventually repatriated those claiming to be refugees from the 1948 war. I think that in retrospect, but listen, hindsight's always 20/20. We can always look back. What you do raise, though, about the Palestinians squandering opportunities, I also talk about that quite a bit in the book. And I think it ultimately does, again, come down to the leadership. What I talk about at the end is the following, is that when we begin to see Palestinian leadership that can articulate a forward-looking vision for a prosperous and successful and politically viable Palestinian state, I think we may have a different equation in front of us. But up until now, Palestinian nationalism has been defined by the destruction of the Jewish state rather than the creation of their own. And I believe that that has been probably the biggest problem facing the Palestinians. And I say this very clearly, that until the Palestinians can reconcile with that, I don't believe that they will be successful in their national aspiration.
Their nationalized product has become human bombs.
Well, that's right. Palestinian, starting in the 1970s, became synonymous with hijacking and terrorism. And then after that, it became synonymous with suicide bombings. And it's unfortunate, again, because I think that, you know, a lot of Palestinians, because of their sort of diaspora culture, have had exposure to democracies. They've had exposure to Western universities. They get it. They understand the value of the United States. They understand what makes this country, for instance, so great. They even understand what makes Israel tick. But yet they have not been able to embrace that for their own culture and their own political entity. And that has been a problem for them, you know, from really the beginning of the conflict. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering.
I'll get to you in a minute. I'll get to you in a minute, I promise.
Real quick, in 2005, when we gave back Gush Katif, we were told, and I speak as we, as a Jew, we were told that there were going to be no rockets being, you know, thrown at or you know, any barragement whatsoever into Israel after we gave that back. Look what happened. Over 6,000 rockets, you know, flying into Israel over a certain number of years. Then also, my second point to the question is just this: what would you have the settlements in the West Bank? How are we going to, you know, fill that disparity if we are to create a Palestinian state? I have cousins who came from Russia and who live in the West Bank and Ariel. So I mean, how are you going to fill that gap and that void?
The first question, or the first point about the 2005 withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, in retrospect, it was a mistake. There were a lot of people in Washington who said, well, listen, if Israel can start to deal with the Palestinians from sort of one state to another, or one state to a quasi-state, and it was military to military, well then, you know, they couldn't claim that there was occupation any longer, and Israel would have the sort of moral upper hand. But what we can see right now is that even after the Palestinians lobbed, you know, several thousand rockets into Israel, and Israel responded, you get the Goldstone report, which alleges, you know, human rights violations. So I believe that it was a grave miscalculation on the part of Ariel Sharon, who was an amazing soldier on behalf of Israeli security during his career, but I think made a grave calculation at the end. I think that, you know, by and large, Israelis are war-weary and are looking for ways to get out of the conflict, when I think that probably ultimately the answer is to be as strong as possible until such a time comes that a negotiation is at hand. But that's not an answer that most Israelis want to hear. Most Israelis are looking for a way to solve the conflict tomorrow, so they don't have to send their children off to the army, where they don't have to worry about being hit by terrorist missiles in the south, or potentially a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. So people are looking for answers, and they're somewhat desperate for them. And I can completely understand, if we lived under those circumstances in this country, we would look for those sorts of answers too. Which leads me to the whole question of the West Bank. I believe that the call for the settlements to be dismantled is the wrong one. And not because I am, the hugest proponent of settlements. I do believe that there is an historical tie between the Jewish people and the West Bank. I mean, we know that Hebron was a biblical city, and there's no reason why Jews shouldn't be allowed to live there. But more broadly, the question is, why should peace, or I guess the preconditions for peace, be that no Jews are allowed to live in the West Bank? Why is it that the West Bank should be Judenrein the way that Saudi Arabia is? Why can't it be that Jews be allowed to live in the West Bank? And if one day there is a settlement that is struck between the Palestinians and Israelis, then those people living in those settlements will have to make a tough decision. Do they want to be Palestinian citizens, or do they want to move back to Israel? But there should be no reason why. I mean, if you think about it right now, there are 1 million Arabs living inside Israel proper. So why can't there be 400,000 Jews living in a population of almost 3 million in the West Bank? This, to me, doesn't make any sense. I believe that this is just something that has been drilled into the heads of those of our State Department and really around the world by the Palestinian nationalist movement. And they've done a very good job of trying to vilify those people who wish to live in the West Bank. I believe that there should not be a country in the world where Jews shouldn't be allowed to live. Similarly, Christians or Muslims, for that matter. Anybody of any religion should be allowed to live in any country where they desire if they feel that they have a tie to the land. And for the Jews that live in the West Bank, they should be allowed to live there. They'll just have to make some tough choices down the line if peace is struck. Yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to pick your brains. This won't interfere with your book.
Okay.
You already mentioned the Goldstone report. If you want to elaborate on that, fine. I want to know the ramifications, but I want to know, is there any validity to the fact that Saudi Arabia could have an agreement with Israel because of their 35% of the population being Shiite, where Israel could land if they have to go into Iran? And also, what would it take to get Syria, which is got a Shiite, is ruling, a Shiite minority is ruling the Sunni majority? What would it take to what would Israel have to do to have the Syrians realize that they are being, could there be a revolution in Syria with anything that Israel could do, because they're being held down by a minority?
Okay. In terms of the Saudis, I'll answer the second, third, and then first.
You mentioned the first.
I'm happy to talk about it. It's a popular question these days. The Saudis, I wouldn't expect an agreement between the Israelis and the Saudis. I think that's highly unlikely. The Saudi people have not been, softened up enough, to say the least. I mean, Israel is absolutely vilified in Saudi Arabia, as are pretty much Christians, Jews, Americans, really anyone of any other nationality. So I wouldn't expect that to happen. There's some speculation about if Israel was to attack Iran, would the Saudis allow the Israelis to fly over Saudi territory so that they don't have to fly up over the Mediterranean, bank a right over Turkey, fly over Iraq, and then into Iran, and probably have to refuel 2 or 3 times, which would obviously make the operation that much more complex. I cannot verify. All I can tell you is that the rumors that you heard are swirling around inside the Beltway, and nobody knows whether that would happen. We do know that the Arab world is deathly afraid of an Iranian bomb. And they probably would cheer on Israel. I don't know about publicly, but they would probably cheer on Israel if Israel did take out the Iranian nuclear facilities. But the question is, would they offer assistance, and what would that mean for future ties? As they say in Hebrew, your geshem is as good as mayim, if that resonates with anybody. Now, as for Syria and revolution in Syria, I would say that the notion of revolution is much more likely inside Iran than it is in Syria. In Iran, we've already seen the foundations of it in the aftermath of the June elections that were fraudulent, that brought Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, or as my friend Michael Medved likes to say, Ahmadin a whack job, to the presidency. The Iranian people were clearly unhappy and were out in the streets in the thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people were out there. There, I believe, there's a possibility for an overthrow of the government. In Syria, it appears that the regime has a much tighter grip, and they are not Shia. They are an offshoot of the Shiites known as Alawis, which are, they also exist in Turkey. They are a minority, but they have a tight grip on the political structure there. You can never say never in the Middle East. It's difficult to predict the future there. But I would not expect an overturning of the regime. You could see an overturning of leadership, because I believe that Bashar al-Assad is not a strong leader. And relies heavily on his lieutenants to keep order. And if they decided that it was time to oust him, they could probably easily do so. But I don't see a revolution coming anytime soon. Now, as for the Goldstone report, it is what I think more than 500 pages of probably, well, at least what Ambassador Michael Oren says is tantamount to blood libel. To suggest that the Israelis carry out warfare in a way that that targets, knowingly targets civilians, is it flies in the face of everything that the IDF was built on. It's not to say that the IDF is a perfect military institution. It's not to say that civilians weren't killed. I think that that is extremely clear, that there were civilians killed during this conflict. The question is, did Israel mean to do it, and were they deliberately targeting civilians? And the answer to that is definitely no. According to everything that I've seen, every Israeli military officer that I've talked to, every politician from Israel, they emphatically state that mistakes were made, but there was no intention of killing civilians. What we do know, though, is just to just look at it from another perspective, is we know that when the rockets, the several thousand, almost 5,000 rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip into southern Israel beginning in 2001, every one of those rockets was actually designed, hopefully, to kill Israeli civilians. In other words, these rockets, you cannot actually target anything. They are crude rockets made out of sewer pipes and fertilizer, household items, and they are incredibly crude. You don't know how far they're going to go, and you don't know where they're going to land. So what the Palestinians would do is simply aim them in the direction of population centers and fire them away. This was not condemned enough over the last 7 years, and was definitely not condemned enough in the Goldstone report. Moreover, we also know that Hamas was using human shields throughout this. They were firing from schools. They were firing from population centers. This was a flagrant violation of human rights. And this is also something that didn't get enough airplay. Why the Goldstone report came out, how it was able to pass through the Human Rights Committee, and now how it's going to even be considered at the General Assembly, to me is, and I have to say this, it's not always popular everywhere I go, but I believe it was a failure of this administration, this White House, to allow it to get to that point. The White House apparently reached out to the Palestinians and said, if you want to see this peace process move forward, if you want to see us continue to try to exact concessions from the Israelis, you're going to have to let go of this report. And moreover, all of the other countries that voted for this report are U.S. allies. Qatar, Kuwait, Egypt, these are all close allies of the United States in the Middle East, and they voted for it nonetheless. The United States should have been able to lobby these states not to vote for it, not just to abstain, but to actually vote against this report moving forward because of all the questionable assertions that were made. And I believe that the White House failed in this regard. And I think it's unfortunate, and now Israel is going to have this sort of albatross on its neck while it's being asked to make other concessions and to move forward on a peace process, which we discussed earlier, is not likely to succeed in the first place. I see right now Israel in a very tough spot, and I don't see it getting out of this tough spot anytime soon. Yeah, it does seem to be getting worse. Yes, ma'am.
The U.S. government's giving the Palestinians millions and millions and millions of dollars. You alluded to the police training. Could you explain a little bit more so on whether that's money well spent or where it should be spent or not spent?
Yeah, there's apparently about $900 million, to my knowledge, earmarked for the Palestinians this year. About $500 million of it has been allocated already to the West Bank, where General Dayton's army is being built. And it's actually being touted as a success. Those who come back to Washington and report on it say that you've got a relatively professional army that is loyal not to one faction or another, but is loyal to the Palestinian cause. My question is, until when? If war breaks out, if conflict breaks out again between the Palestinians and Israelis, we saw the Palestinians in the year 2000. They had been receiving weapons and training and all sorts of other things from the United States and from Israel, and they turned those weapons against Israel during the Intifada that began in fall of 2000. The question is, can that happen again, and is that money well spent? I would say that we run a real risk of having those guns turned on Israel again, and that would be antithetical to peace in the region. The other $400 million, and by the way, you've probably seen all sorts of emails that have gotten to your email box about how the administration has earmarked $400 million and they're allowing Hamas members to live in the United States. There's a lot of sort of spam that's been going around. All those things are not true. The $400 million right now is locked. The Congress realizes that if the $400 million is allocated to the Gaza Strip for rebuilding after Operation Cast Lead, it would go into the hands of Hamas, and that would be financing a recognized terrorist organization. So that money's frozen for right now, and for good reason. The question is, can there be a way to have that money integrate into Palestinian society to alleviate some of the suffering without having Hamas graft a good deal of it, which is what happens every time Hamas gets its hands on money. As a former official for the U.S. Treasury, I can tell you that Hamas is excellent at finding ways of laundering money, U.S. and otherwise. They'll say that it's used for, the good of charity, but what it, almost always the money ends up back in the hands of the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades, which is the so-called military wing of Hamas. But in fact, really all of Hamas is a military wing. There are just various endeavors that help further that under different names. You'll take a student here, yeah.
A lot of policymakers make a lot of points with regards towards the two-state solution, which has failed in the past before. But why aren't policymakers looking at this, having that it has a more complex issue towards being fueled by religious hatred towards Israel, which is the fundamental aspect that drives the radical Islamic extremists to go commit acts of terrorism against Israel. A lot of them focus with regards toward policies that were designed towards building perhaps a two-state solution, but none of them seem to be in primary interest with regards towards the Palestinians' charter in Hamas.
Right.
Considering the Hamas charter itself calls for the destruction of Israel.
Yeah.
And it's stated clearly by their politicians.
Clearly.
So why aren't politicians focusing on this issue that it's not just the regards towards policy that's a problem, but they also have to deal with the religious hatred
Gotcha.
problem that's fueled in the minds of the people in Palestine.
Well, there are two things here at play. One is, there is what we now call the battle for hearts and minds that has been launched in Washington under the Bush administration, and it's continuing under the Obama administration. And the idea is to try to unpoison minds, to try to teach them more about, the merits of the United States or democracy or what have you. I would say that those efforts thus far have yielded questionable results at best. And in fact, the ideology of radical Islam continues to grow. A lot of people ask me what that looks like. How bad of a problem is it? I'll give you just sort of an overview. Let's put it this way: that according to elections, polls taken in Muslim countries around the world, I would say a very safe estimate would be that about 20% of the Muslim world embraces a radical ideology, that they view Israel, the United States, the West as the enemy and see Islam as sort of the religion that must win in the end in a battle that is prescribed in the Quran and the stars. The good news is that it's only 20%. I mean, that should all make us breathe a little easier. But hold your breath, because when you think about the fact that there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, you're looking at, anybody here a math major? 300 million people who seek the destruction of the United States. Roughly speaking, that's about the population. Right. It's about the size of the population of the United States. So this is obviously incredibly disconcerting, and it's something that we're aware of, but I have not seen anybody really figure out how to combat the ideology of Islamism or radical Islam. With regard specifically to the Arab-Israeli conflict, I can tell you that it is the favorite pet rock of the State Department. Diplomacy faltered during the Bush administration. The Bush administration basically said, we are not moving forward with the peace process as long as there are people within the Palestinian leadership that embrace violence, which I think is an admirable goal. Did it forward things, on a diplomatic level? Absolutely not. And the Palestinians dug in their heels, but would that mean that they would never come around? I don't know. But in the meantime, now that we've got an administration that is more open to the idea of diplomacy, what I'm watching is a State Department where the machinery is kicked into high gear, and it is a goal that the State Department has. It is something that they see on the horizon that they are very eager to wrap their hands around, and it is a prize that they seek. Whether it is in the best interest of the region, of the Israelis or the Palestinians, in my opinion, is not something that they think about. They are more focused on the process, on the nuts and bolts of diplomacy than they are. I mean, you think about it, when you talk about peace, it sounds like it's in the best interest of everybody. But if you try to achieve peace in the wrong way, or you try to do it too soon, too early, without having the right foundations, you can watch the house crumble, which is what happened in the year 2000. So I think that, again, you're right. The ideology of radical Islam needs to be addressed, and I believe, we started to do it after 9/11, but I think that the interest in this problem has waned significantly here in this country, and we're just really now in the business again of wanting to build peace, and with the idea that peace is a good thing no matter how we get there, and I think that that's largely incorrect. How many are we doing?
We have time for 2 more questions.
Do you want to choose them since I don't want to be the bad guy?
Oh, you're making me the bad guy. Well,
That's right.
Let me take a person and then a student if there's one. I see a student in the back and then, wonderful. So, gentlemen and then the student, please.
I was a student.
Well, you can still go.
Then you count twice.
Just a quick, it's really follow up on what we talked about before regarding Jews living in the West Bank. I just was looking up from the Aspen Institute in July, and one of your scholars, Daniel Pipes, had a whole piece about Salam Fayyad being open-minded to the idea of Jews living in the West Bank. Has there been anything other than that one comment where he just said he doesn't disagree with the concept?
Well, what we've seen actually is since the initiative to halt all settlement activity in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which has been something over the last 6 months out of Washington, what we see now is Palestinians digging in their heels more and saying that we're not going to get back to the negotiating table as long as settlements are building. Which again, I don't. If that's something that the Israelis and Palestinians want to negotiate, that's fine. But I don't believe that it should be a starting point for negotiations. That there are Jews who wish to live there, I don't think it should be illegal, and I don't even actually necessarily see it as provocative. No one is stopping the Palestinians from living there, and they can continue to build their own state as they please. The fact that Jews are building side by side with them could actually even potentially foster goodwill, if looked at in the right way. But I have not seen more signals out of the West Bank, and definitely not out of the Gaza Strip, from either of the leaderships about this.
I know you used up my question, but just do you think they were emboldened by the President's UN speech where he pretty much came out and said that the U.S. does not condone any kind of settlement activity?
Absolutely. In other words, if the President of the United States, who is supposed to be the strongest ally of Israel, says that settlements have to be ceased and that they're illegal and that the U.S. doesn't support an Israel that does that, and all of a sudden, the Israel-U.S. relationship seems to be on slightly shaky ground, which I think many people would probably characterize it as such until maybe the last month or so, that sends a message to the Palestinians, for sure, that they can demand certain things in negotiations. In other words, all they're doing is demanding what the President did. So what's wrong with that? I think that it was counterproductive. And by the way, I would say that the administration right now seems to have recognized that was counterproductive. You're not seeing those same demands. The administration has pulled back from that very sort of stringent position. They're not saying that they support settlements, but they're not saying a halt to all settlements. They're talking about natural growth and the like, which I think is more reasonable. But again, I think it does call into question that whole idea of why the West Bank needs to be Judenrein, or why all settlements will need to be dismantled in order for there to be peace. I think that if there is peace, and this is something that Daniel Pipes always says, is you don't make peace with your enemies. You make peace with your former enemies. That's how you're going to have successful peace, is when they're not opposed to having Jews living side by side with them. They don't hate the Jews living there, but they understand that they're going to be part of their political landscape. That's the hope. That's the hope.
I'm a Middle East student at the university campus, and I'm Jewish, and they're super biased, and it's really horrible that they don't even give you a formal introduction over there or announce that you're going to be here. And there's 4 Lebanese kids in my class that always end up laughing at everything I say all the time and pretty much put me down. And I'm always standing up for the Jewish side, and I just think it's horrible that there's not an active Jewish community on that campus, making these statements, because everybody who's not Jewish and taking these courses are being taught different. They're just being taught sympathy towards what's going on on the Palestinian side and not on the Israeli side. And it's really sad, because it's always a student, somebody that's an outsider, the politics part of it and a writer or something talking about it. And professors really don't, I guess they're not knowledgeable or they're just not talking about it. I don't know. But it's not happening. It's like always a student defending two socks.
Well, I can.
Please join my advisory board.
Well, let me try to address a couple of things here. Number one, you've got a great professor right here, so try to take a class with him.
No, I go to the other campus.
No, I know. But let me say this: that your situation is not a unique one, unfortunately. The state of Middle Eastern studies in America right now has been critiqued by many. Notably, there's a scholar by the name of Martin Kramer. If you haven't read his book, it's called Ivory Towers on Sand, The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies in America. It is a brutal expose of the failure of Middle Eastern studies. What it shows is that there is a groupthink that currently exists within the professorate, and it is nearly unanimous. I was lucky. I went to Emory University in Atlanta, where there is a wonderful professor there by the name of Kenneth Stein, who teaches and challenged me to learn both the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian one. And it's largely his doing that has me here today. In other words, because I had to learn both narratives, and because he would not tolerate people just saying one political line or another, and made people think, that's what made me realize this was a wonderful field to be in. But those professors are few and far between. What we have right now is a professorate that really seems to be involved more in an activism and a supporting of a Palestinian narrative, and peddles that as truth rather than understanding that there are two narratives. And by the way, this discussion that I had tonight, as well as several others, I could probably also do from the Palestinian narrative because of the training that I got both at Hebrew U and Emory. And unfortunately, I can tell you that this is probably not what you want to hear, but it's going to be up to you. You're going to have to do the extra reading. And by the way, you're not going to be able to put those answers on your test. Your term papers and final exams cannot reflect everything but if you learn the basic documents, you learn resolutions 242, and you learn 338, and you learn the building blocks of the conflict, that all remains the same. There are certain things that cannot be denied by these professors. Yes, they will vilify Israel, but that should not stand in your way of learning about a fascinating part of the world, and I commend you for sticking with it. Once again, folks, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank again the JCRC. I want to thank Judaic Studies Program. I want to thank Pablo Levy and Hillel Second Generation. I want to thank SGA. Please join us next time for our event on November 17th for the Middle East Society. Judaic Studies has also an upcoming event. Flyers for that event, notices are available in the back, and so is for us. Again, Jonathan's book is available in the back. Please purchase it. I want to thank two people that I did not thank before thanking Jonathan again. Ingrid Lopez, our student associate for the Middle East Society, thank you for all your help. And Jan Solomon, thank you, and Jan Solomon as well, always helping us on that. Again, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful. Jonathan will be available to autograph his book as well.